Thanks for joining me for another installment of True Crime and Tapping. I'm coming to you today to tell you about one case that is an unsolved serial killer case from Cleveland, Ohio in the 1930s. And it is one of my most researched cases that I will occasionally look into to see if it has any more information released on it. And I also find that many people are really unaware of this case in the first place. So I like to discuss it with other true crime enthusiasts when I can. So I'm hoping today that you find this case as intriguing as I do, and enjoy some tapping and paper rustling and page turning as I read. Before we start, I'm going to light this candle for some ambiance, and also just because I like candles. And I'll use this old school matchbook because I like those too. Oh yeah. That's nice. One fun, I suppose, detail of this case is that it involves a famous American historical figure who those who are very familiar with mob or mob-related history will know Elliot Ness, one of the Untouchables, the leader in fact. He was the public safety commissioner at the time that these murders took place in Cleveland, Ohio, and ultimately he was unsuccessful in helping catch the killer who did these crimes. But he was quite involved with a pursuit of a suspect who most likely did the crimes, and it sort of created a nemesis for him as he got closer to solving this. I will tell you a little bit about those details at the end after I relay information about the overview of these crimes and the victims themselves. As always, we are going to pay the victims respect as we talk about them, even though this was a very long time ago, and I will try to relay the information factually as best as possible. I also need to tell you that I will be talking about dismemberment and beheading in this overview of the case. If you do end up looking this case up after this video, I will warn you that there are additional details relating to these ways the bodies were disposed that you may not want to read about. So please do not keep watching if this disturbs you. Okay, let's begin. So this case is referred to as the Cleveland Torso Murders. And the killer, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. And this case takes place in Cleveland, Ohio, or took place in Cleveland, Ohio. There were 12 confirmed victims of this killer. It was never solved. Only 2 of the victims have ever positively been identified. The other 10 have been never identified, well, with 1 being a possible identification. And I'll go into that when I get to that victim. the modern day areas of Cleveland, Ohio that these bodies were found in and this took place, I will let you know in the descriptions of each victim. And you can also do research on this if you find that you feel compelled to do that. So in this case, there were 12 victims, as I said, and they start out with a male who is called Edward Andersey, and he was found on September 23rd of 1935. And he was also found with a second victim who was called John Doe number 1. They were found in an area called Jackass Hill of Cleveland, which is near the Kingsbury Run area. Before I get further into the descriptions of these victims, I will also mention that this area of Cleveland was a Hooverville or a shantytown at the time, and all these victims were considered working class and frequented brothels, gambling dens, and other places that were seen unsavory at the time. And that is to blame for somewhat of the reason that police may have not been able to catch this killer, though manpower was put into investigation of this case eventually, which I will also detail. It was a largely ignored situation because of the victims and their backgrounds. The John Doe who was found with Edward Andersey was actually killed 3 to 4 weeks prior to the discovery of his body in the area of Kingsbury Run. The third victim was called Florence Polillo, and she was killed in January of 1936, and her body was found in February of the same year. The body was found between East 20th Street and Orange Avenue in downtown Cleveland. John Doe number 2 has some very distinct details that were found on his body, namely 6 tattoos. The tattoos range from personal art, like an anchor and a heart, or a flag with the initials WCG, to a head of a comic character who was popular at the time, and even a cupid on his leg. Despite his distinct tattoos and a death mask being made of his face that was shown at the Great Lakes exhibition in 1936, which is kind of a World's Fair type event, his body has never been identified to this day. John Doe number 3 was actually killed prior to John Doe number 2, and he was discovered after John Doe number 2. He was killed in May 1936, and his body was found in July of 1936. It was in the Big Creek area of Cleveland, outside of Cleveland, west of the city. And he's the only victim to have ever been found there. Next to his body was a pile of clothes folded, and the clothes were blood spattered. There are no clues to this day as to why this was, and his head was found near the body, but he is still unidentified as well. John Doe number 4 was found in September of 1936 in Kingsbury Run as well. It was 2 days after his death that he was found. His head was never found, and there was no ID that could be made. There are also no additional details about this victim. Jane Doe number 1 has a very interesting detail about her, in that she was found in a place called Euclid Beach, which is on the shore of Lake Erie, and another murder had taken place there, or a body was found there in 1934. And this body, which I will talk about later, this victim, is called the Lady of the Lake. She was found, like I said, in 1934, and she died in a very similar way to many of these victims. Some consider her what they call a non-canonical victim of this killer, or possibly even the first victim of this killer, but I'll get into that in a minute. Jane Doe number 1 was found in the same place, Euclid Beach, and she was killed in February of 1937, which was her finding her body was 3 to 4 days after she was killed. So not a lot of time between those two events. They never found her head and her ID. An ID was never made, so she is still unidentified. The second Jane Doe in this case, who is our 8th victim, if you're keeping count, was found in June of 1937 and beneath a bridge called the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge, which is near Cleveland. She was killed 1 year before, so she was actually killed in June of 1936 and found in June of 1937. She is possibly a woman called Rose Wallace. So at the beginning of this, I told you that there was a third ID, a possible third ID of a victim. This woman was identified via her son and also some dental records that police were able to find from this ID based on the son's testimony. However, the dentist that did the work and kept the records had died several years before her body was attempted to be ID'd, so they could never confirm if these records were accurate or not. But it is considered a potential match of a woman called Rose Wallace, and we will probably never fully know unless possibly a descendant of hers comes forward and is offering to submit a DNA test, which probably isn't worth the time and effort, unfortunately, to this situation, as this case is so old and the killer is long dead. John Doe number 5 was found in July of 1937 and killed 2 to 3 days prior to his discovery. And he was pulled out of the Cuyahoga River, which is in the Cleveland area as well, near the Cleveland Flats, which is where Kingsbury Run is. The Cleveland Flats is still currently an area that is a neighborhood or a geographical area in Cleveland, and you can go there today. It has very nice apartments, entertainment complexes, and just nothing like it used to be back in the 30s. Very strikingly different. Victim 10 is Jane Doe number 3. She was found April 1938, but killed 3 to 5 days beforehand. She was found in the same location as that previous John Doe. A head was never found and no ID was made. She was the only victim to have drugs in her system out of all of them, interestingly enough. Jane Doe number 4 is victim 11. She was found August of 1938, but killed between February and April of that year. So this is months. Her death was months before the discovery of her body. She was found in the Lakeshore Dump, which is on East 9th Street in Cleveland, and the head was recovered, but no ID was made. John Doe number 6 is the final victim, number 12, and he was found at the same time as the Jane Doe I just mentioned in the same location, but he was killed between November 1937 and January of 1938. His head was also found, but no ID was made. Now, I talked a little bit just before about something called non-canonical victims, which is when a serial killer may have killed someone, but there is no distinct evidence to tie them, that serial killer, to the killings of this individual. So there are assumptions made that possibly these victims are assigned to the killer or they are not, depending on who is investigating the case. There are a couple of non-canonical instances of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, one being the Lady of the Lake, which I had just mentioned. She was found in the Euclid Beach area of Lake Erie in 1934, and she is considered by some as victim 0 of this case. She was killed in a very similar way, and her body was treated in a very similar way to the other victims. Then, in addition, between 1921 and 1934, and again in 1939, between 1939 and 1942, dismembered bodies were found near Newcastle, Pennsylvania, in a swamp outside of the town, and these sprees, or these instances of these murders, were called the Murder Swamp Killings, and the person was called the Murder Swamp Killer. The victims were killed in the same way as the Mad Butcher killed his victims, their victims. And they were linked to these locations, Newcastle and Cleveland, Ohio, by a railroad called the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. It ran twice a day between the two cities, and there was a detective that worked the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run case. His name was Peter Merlo, and he believed that they were the same person, this killer from Newcastle and the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. He would even get on this train twice a day in a disguise and try to see if he could find the killer for several years. He was ultimately unsuccessful, but I think his theory has weight personally because these are very similar instances and the geographical location is so close. So as we get to the end of the victim list, I will talk about the attempt to solve this case, which was through Public Safety Commissioner at the time, Eliot Ness, the famous Eliot Ness. And during the investigation, he was pulled into certain aspects of it, even though he wasn't a primary investigator on the case. But he did do raids and throughout Kingsbury Run, throughout these shanty towns, looking for any clues or possibly in parties of interest that might have been tied to the killings. He ultimately actually burned the shanty towns down in Kingsbury Run because of this murder spree, because of these victims and how many there were. In his investigation and the investigation of the police at the time, they had several suspects, but one stood out, and his name was Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, and he was born in 1894. He had the distinction of being in World War I. He was a vet who was actually part of a medical unit who did amputations often. And Eliot Ness conducted several interviews with him, as well as gave him multiple polygraph tests. These polygraph tests, as much as you can believe in polygraph tests, because the science is not there, and I would encourage you to do more research on that if you have never heard that before. He failed them spectacularly, this doctor, and Eliot Ness could not convict him, however, because he never had any solid physical evidence. He was reluctant to bring this man to before a court, or to try to bring him to trial for any of this, because he was actually the first cousin of Ness's primary political component at the time, a man called Martin L. Sweeney. He was a congressman. And Sweeney himself, Martin Sweeney, actually publicly taunted Ness when the investigation was happening, because he could not catch this killer, and he was using it, Martin Sweeney, for political gain, exploiting Ness's inability to catch the killer. Dr. Francis Sweeney would eventually commit himself to a mental hospital and stay there, being transferred to a few different locations until his death in a veterans hospital in 1964. Between the time he committed himself and his death, he actually sent Eliot Ness many correspondences to Ness himself and his family, taunting him and harassing him throughout about 10 years of time. You can see the aftermath, or the bits and pieces that are left over from this case, at the Cleveland Police Museum. It has copies of the death masks and very specific details about all of the victims, if you're interested in pursuing research further. And I would again encourage you to look up this case and do some further reading if it intrigues you as much as it intrigued me when I first heard about it. Modernly, as I said before, the Cleveland Flats area is actually a modern entertainment district, and a place that many people live in condos and apartments. You would never know its sordid history or the tragic past that it holds. Even now, I have been there and seen the area. One of my very good friends lives in Cleveland, and it is quite a change from anything horrific in the way you could imagine this happening, or the time you could imagine it happening in. Thank you for joining me for another installment of True Crime and Tapping. I'll be back with another one very soon. If you would like to see coverage of a specific case, please leave me a comment. I would be happy to cover anything you would want to hear about, especially something that might not have been covered by another podcast or video or documentary before. Thanks for watching, and I will see you soon.